Hi and welcome. As people continue to join, we will play a short video of the State of the World Cash 2020 report findings.
In a crisis, cash and voucher assistance can drive more local, multi-actor humanitarian action. It catalyzes change by operating alongside other financial flows, and in turn, strengthens ties with governments and local actors. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated this effect. However, there are still barriers to increasing the role of local organizations, such as 1. Complex partnership requirements. 2. Underestimating the capacity of local organizations. And 3. Being unable to access cash funding due to donor restrictions. International humanitarians can and must work with local partners in a way that fully recognizes their value, ensures a more equal partnership, and helps to build lasting capacity. To find out more, read the State of the World's Cash at calpnetwork.org/SOWC 2020.
Okay, welcome to the East Africa State of the World's Cash 2020 webinar. The video you have just watched summarizes the findings of the State of the World's Cash 2020 report into just 4 minutes. Today, we will be looking at Chapter 3 of the report, which is on quality programming. And the questions we are asking are, how do the findings of the State of the World's Cash 2020 report on quality programming relate to our situation here in East Africa? And from whose perspective or by whose standards are we measuring quality of cash and voucher assistance? In today's webinar, we have a panel of experts, key actors from various parts of the humanitarian sector who will be leading the discussion today. And these are Sumananjali Mohanty, who is the country director for NRC Ethiopia, Teti from Give Directly Africa Operation, Killen Otieno from JAM International, Fouquet from FCDO Somalia at the Department of International Development. And to moderate the panel, we have Maha from the Center of Financial Inclusion. But before we get into that, I would like to run through some few highlights from the quality programming chapter of the State of the World Cash 2020 report. So let's start with a short survey. Do you think in East Africa, we have made progress in incorporating recipients' perspective in CVA? Do you think we have made progress in incorporating recipients' perspective in CVA in East Africa? The question will pop up on your screen. Please take a moment to reply. As that goes on, we will run through some of the ground rules. And these are the webinar will last for 90 minutes. Please use the Q&A for questions and the chat box for any other comments throughout the webinar. We will do our best to ensure that all the questions are responded to. And if we don't get to all of them, we will develop a Q&A document and share after this webinar. The session will be recorded and the recording will be shared on various platforms. So I think we have all responded to the poll, and I see that majority of you think that we have made progress in incorporating recipient perspective in East Africa. And we will see how this compares to the global perspectives, but we can already tell from the findings on the screen that in East Africa, we think that we have made much more progress in incorporating recipients' finding. The global survey found that 62% of the respondents agreed that humanitarian agencies are increasingly considering recipient perspectives in designing CVA programs. So before we get to the panel, I would like to run through some key highlights of Chapter 3 of the State of the World Cash 2020 report. And I will be running through 4 clusters of findings on CVA and quality from the chapter. So the first cluster of findings that I would like to highlight is that perceptions on progress in quality of CVA are generally positive. 67% of those that responded to the survey told us that their organizations have put in place mechanisms to improve the quality of cash and voucher assistance over the last 2 years. There was also a general indication that there's a shift from focus on scale to focus on quality, as indicated by investments in monitoring, in independent evaluations, and in accountability. And especially accountability being defined as understanding the recipient's perspectives and incorporating this into their programming. There is also increasing consensus on what practitioners term as quality of cash and voucher assistance. And this is with regards to effectiveness, with regards to efficiency, and with regards to accountability. There was also, recipients also told us that there is more, that there is need to better measure quality, that there's more consensus on the need to better measure quality, and particularly to put the recipient's perspective at the center of our M&E systems. The second cluster of findings that I would like to share is around understanding recipient perspectives. And what the respondents told us is that there has been increasing investment in M&E systems and in complaints feedback mechanisms, as well as PDMs, which is how recipients' feedback is being collected. And I think you'll agree with me that this is the same here in East Africa. Some organizations have also used participatory research methods to capture recipients' perspectives, and there is potential in the use of this approach. However, difficulties in employing this approach in relation to capacity gaps within the humanitarian sector, as well as resources required to be able to do this well, were reported. And the last thing is that, on the other hand, the increasing scale of cash and voucher assistance has seen the use of increasingly larger operational models that reduce the last mile person-to-person contact with the beneficiary. And that's reducing the ability of the recipient's feedback to be incorporated into the cash and voucher programs. The third cluster of findings that I would like to share is around third-party monitoring. And the findings of the report told us that third-party monitoring could play a role in improving quality of cash and voucher assistance and wider programming. However, more evidence is needed to understand whether there's value for money in using this approach. And as we all know, third-party monitoring has in the past been used, especially in conflict settings, Somalia, for instance, here in the region, mainly for verification and audit purposes. But in the recent times, we have seen this approach being used for learning and accountability. And I think we have seen this approach being used in Somalia, and perhaps Seb will talk about DFID's work in Somalia with third-party monitors. We also have information that it is being used in Uganda as well as in Ethiopia. But perhaps the most learning comes from the Chameleons program in Lebanon, outside the region, where it has been found that there is potential in using this approach to further improve quality of cash and voucher assistance, but the value for money still needs to be justified. The last cluster of key highlights that I would like to share is around the use of evidence for CVA program design decisions. And here, we have seen that there have been investments in monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, as well as complaints feedback mechanisms to collect feedback from recipients. The report also indicated that there have been improvements in good practice required to improve the quality of CVA. And so these are not the challenges when it comes to incorporating evidence into CVA programs. As a matter of fact, the key informants and respondents told us most significantly that the biggest challenge in incorporating evidence into CVA program design was less about the lack of evidence and more about systemic barriers. And these systemic barriers had to do with issues such as a focus on scale compared to quality, issues such as organizational mandates, and issues such as lack of capacities within the organizations. So those are the 4 clusters of findings that I wanted to share with you today, and that relate to the discussion we are going to have shortly. And we will see how we are doing on that with the panel discussion. But before we get to that, just a point of caution in relation to the discussion, the presentation I've just made, and the discussion that we are going to have. And this has to do with the fact that a lot of the points that are coming up have to do with quality programming of humanitarian humanitarian interventions in general, and not only quality of cash and voucher assistance. And perhaps the fact that this come up when you mention quality of cash and voucher assistance has to do with the fact that a lot of organizations still hold the cash and voucher assistance to higher standards than other forms of humanitarian aid. So perhaps the challenge here is to see how to bring the discussion from quality of cash and voucher assistance to quality of the humanitarian response in general. That is all I had to share today. I will now hand over to Maha Khan for the panel discussion. Maha. Maha leads the strategic initiatives and manages the data capabilities team at the Center of Financial Inclusion. She has over 15 years of experience spearheading and managing multi-million-dollar research and strategic operations programs in 15 countries across Asia and Africa, focusing on financial and social inclusion and technology for social impact. Prior to joining CFI, Maha was the Director of Insights for GSMA Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Program in Kenya and Senior Manager for the MasterCard Foundation Partnership for Finance in a Digital Africa at Karibu Digital. Over to you, Maha.
Thanks so much, Sepenzi, and hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be moderating an exciting discussion between our esteemed panelists today, especially at a time when we are seeing such devastating socio and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And according to the World Food Programme, up to about 500 million people could face extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic. And 130 million additional people can face food insecurity by the end of the year. Fortunately, governments and humanitarian organizations are stepping up to address some of these challenges. And this year alone has seen about 340 cash-based social assistance programs being used or set up in response to COVID-19. Cash programming and humanitarian assistance in East Africa can look very different in each country, naturally, because of the diversity of the refugee and displaced population, as well as the infrastructure in each country. So ranging from Kenya and Somalia that has robust digital infrastructure and solutions to other countries that may not have existing social safety net structures to easily facilitate CVA. So we've just heard from Sepenzi about some of the things on quality in CVA and the role cash can play in recipients' lives, and really CVA, in terms of the quality of CVA, focusing around 3 measurements: efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability, which we'll be discussing today. Humanitarian organizations and donors are really increasingly recognizing that improving humanitarian action hinges on better understanding and incorporating feedback from those that are affected by crisis. And that has to be done throughout the program cycle. But while this is acknowledged and recognized, in practice, we see that donors and aid agencies' targets and benchmarks are still actually driving CVA funding and design. Sorcha O'Callaghan, who's the Director of Humanitarian Policy at a policy group at ODI, she said something at the State of the World's Cash launch event that really stuck with me. Cash offers a huge transformative potential, but as far as the system is privileging the interests of the agencies over people in crisis, we won't be able to see it. So in this webinar, we'll be speaking with experts who define quality in CVA programming, how that's measured, and how quality is actually implemented when, for instance, there's a focus on scale or value for money, as Sepenzi was referring to earlier. What role does localization play in providing opportunities to bring recipients' voices into the center of humanitarian action, and which local actors are actually best placed to do so? So realizing these types of changes will require collaboration across the sector. So I'm really pleased to have a diverse group of experts with us to share their experiences and insights today. So welcome to all the panelists, and I will ask all of our panelists to have their video on so I can see you. So what I'd like to start with today is really around the role of localization. So the pandemic is, as we mentioned, both increasing the use of CVA by governments and humanitarian actors, as well as seemingly increasing the need for localization as international actors headed back home due to distancing or lockdown measures. And as Sepenzi had mentioned, the State of the World's Cash report this year found that a little over half of those surveyed believe that national and local organizations have been increasingly involved in the implementation of CVA over the last few years, but there are still many barriers that persist for effective participation and leadership of local stakeholders. And some of these systemic barriers are that local organizations struggle to get direct international humanitarian funding, they're left out of key strategic and design decisions, and perhaps only focusing on implementation, and there's generally a lack of a really true partnership culture. So Killen, I'm going to actually turn the first question to you. Given JAM International, which is an African-focused NGO helping Africa help itself, what is the role of localization in building more effective community engagement and programs based on or in response to recipients' perspectives? And maybe you can also add what types of actors or organizations could the humanitarian sector leverage at the local level to facilitate improved programming, right? This could be local private sector actors like banks, MNOs, fintechs, government, civil society, and of course, local humanitarian organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Maha, and thank you very much for welcoming me to the webinar. And I just want to welcome all our participants wherever you are. I just want to underscore something that you mentioned, Maha, that improving humanitarian action hinges on better understanding and incorporating the perspectives of crisis-affected people. And that's a very powerful statement. We need to remember that. I also want to reinforce the observation made by O'Callaghan. I was the director of humanitarian policy at ODI. She says that cash offers a huge potential for transformation. But as far as the system is privileging interests of agencies over people, we may not be able to see or experience that potential. So localization basically reinforces the subject of accountability and quality. And as you correctly pointed out, Maha, in your opening remarks, it also brings the voices of recipients into the center of humanitarian action. It brings clarity to the question of whether aid recipients should have a say about the form of assistance that they are about to receive or not. So because cash and vouchers assistance affect multiple community systems, including markets, formal and informal food systems, and various livelihoods groups, more in-depth understanding of these systems is therefore really required as we plan and as we work with the communities to assist them. And this is where the benefits of localization actually comes in for me, because large international NGOs, they hardly have local understanding of the systems and the customs and social issues and how these social issues and the systems actually interact with aid. And the local actors, on the other hand, and local NGOs, if you like, are better placed to understand how all forms of assistance are likely to interact with the local systems. And as I mentioned earlier, they probably already have better solutions and approaches of how aid can be optimized in such contexts. The COVID-19 pandemic has just taught us that with movement restrictions and all the lockdowns that we experienced, that we need to appreciate that the landscape has changed and the way of delivering aid has changed. And when there are restrictions and lockdowns, the local communities and local systems are probably better placed to respond. And this is not simply about replacing large international NGOs with the local NGOs. It requires a little bit more of the recognition, otherwise, that local humanitarian ecosystems do exist and that they can be effective, as we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic and the responses that were organized around the local communities and local organizations. Those ones need to be strengthened and enabled. That ecosystem that I'm talking about, the humanitarian ecosystem, that is sometimes invisible to the international actors, includes the community themselves. It also includes the local NGOs. It includes the local government, the civil societies, the local traders, and the corporate world. I'll talk to you a little bit about how JAM, the organization that I work for, organized a response in South Africa recently. So if the ultimate goal collectively is to ensure that needs of the people affected are met in an effective way, and at the same time making sure that it's localized, we need to adopt a localization approach that promotes partnerships across the multiple and different mandates. As I said, it's not about replacing the international NGOs and the local NGOs. All of these actors have a role to play. So we need to look at how the different sectors can come together and which roles they can play in terms of just making sure that we create an enabling condition for locally led responses. So the Joint Aid Management, the organization that I work for, as I mentioned, our headquarters is here in South Africa. And as a response for the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa, the government of South Africa requested us to take the lead on developing a cash-based and voucher system. The e-voucher that we designed and implemented in Jam, South Africa, led to the optimization. And I would like us to underscore optimization of aid, how that happened when Jam International came on board to assist the government of South Africa in reaching the most people. But the most interesting part is that the outcomes that we realized from our response led to, one, increased access to food by vulnerable households through the markets and the kiosk systems and the spaza shops in South Africa. Because of working with the spaza shops, the communities would go and redeem their vouchers at the time when they want. So they did not have to queue up, and that gives them the dignity as they receive aid at the same time. But the most interesting part of it was that the assistance through the spaza shops and the kiosks enabled the kiosks to keep running despite the pandemic, so that the people who depend on the kiosks and the shops did not lose their livelihoods, because the cash and voucher system that we introduced was enabling the people to receive the food and the shops to also keep running and supporting those businesses. But then there was also apart from supporting the informal food systems, one of the things which was not intended but was an interesting outcome was that it strengthened the social networks and the connections between the communities and the spaza shop owners in a way that reinforces the social networks and strengthens the local coping strategies that these communities have in their relationship. Apart from that, there was the leveraging of the technology and innovation, which of course brings in, advancement on, the platforms that we use for us using telecommunications. So for me, that's what I'd like our listeners to look at and see that we need to support localization. We need to look at localization frameworks that do not necessarily mean that we replace one with another, but actually recognizes the potentials and capacities we have with the communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Killen. That was really interesting. And how you say that we're not replacing one with another, but really leveraging the various expertise that various organizations and actors at the local level will bring. And I'm just wondering for all of the panelists, whether you think that cash can play this pivotal role in leveling the playing field, so to speak, for humanitarian organizations, or do you think we're creating new or further bureaucracies? Going back to this idea that you were saying, Killen, we're not replacing, but really more leveraging. So I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that.
Hi, Maha.
Hi, Sumananjali.
Hi, hello, everybody. So a good thought. Thanks, Killen, for that opening, thoughts from your side. And I'm wondering, so of course, localization is something that we all are aiming for, and we have been having this discussion for some years to come, a couple of years now, grand bargain and all of that discussions are happening. Again, the movement from what we aspire to be and where we are, I think the gap is quite huge. And I probably want to be a bit challenging here and then challenge this thought of that we don't want to replace. We don't want to replace. It was quite often repeated in this conversation. And I feel probably that is the reason why we actually are truly not going localization. because of course I represent one of the international organizations, and I have been working with other international organizations as well. I feel maybe we are too scared to let go, and therefore our investments on local organizations, and I'll try and break it into 3 different categories maybe. When I say local organization right now, I mean the local civil society organizations, national civil society organizations. I do feel that we talk about partnerships, we talk about capacity building, empowering them so that they are the front line and everything. But it's most often than not, it's all about a marginal capacity building. So we will train you on cash and voucher program, for example. And then the moment the project finishes and staff have left, the organization is back to square one. But we will probably never put in enough investment in terms of money to actually make sure that they have systems in place that they can get funding directly from the donor. Why should we be there as a middle group? And then what happens is, and this is my personal experience, what happens is then we try and do the grassroots kind of, I'm sorry to quote it, like, so you go and do the identification, you go and do the post-distribution monitoring, and we will keep the big chunk of money so that we can, do it through a bank, or we can do it through a technology, mobile or whichever kind of mechanism. So we still kind of claim to be having the bigger chunk of money doing it directly. And we never grow the partner to understand what are the nitty-gritties in terms of actually being in control of having that CVA program being delivered directly by them. Do they have enough systems? Can donors trust the local organizations to do it directly? Can they pay the money directly, funding directly to them? And that's why I feel that as international organizations, we slowly, steadily have to move into the space where we should say, we are happy, ECHO, DFID, whoever, OFDA, USAID, whoever you are, directly. This is the partner we invested massively on. We probably take a guarantee that they will not mess up in terms of their, in terms of their systems and all. Please go ahead and give that a direct funding. And I believe we don't do enough of that. And I'm challenging all of us here to be able to do that. Again, second level, localization, talking to the private sector, the local vendors. Our systems are never geared towards local vendors. We probably are, as international organizations, maybe a bit better place to partner with a MasterCard Foundation, a Safaricom, a GSMA, those kind of big entities. But there are lots of, smaller private entities who are there who can help us facilitate a CVA program. A classical, thing that we often mess up is water tracking. Like, it can be talked about, and slowly, steadily, people are moving into how do we do water voucher and how do we link up. The water vendors are not necessarily the big private sector. It's not being run by somebody else. So it is that local level. How do we internally, as in international organization, how do we shift the gears to at least start looking at those is something that we should be able to. And finally is the local governments. Again, how do we, invest, really, truly invest on them, so that when we are supposed to leave a space, a country, a jurisdiction, whatever you call, we have left enough capacities and enough systems so that it moves, and they know how to run the show. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sumananjali, for that. And having come from the private sector working in this space, the relationship was more sort of supplier, humanitarian organization versus a partnership. I'm actually going to move on to a next question on scale versus quality. This is sort of reminding me of that while we're seeing an increasing use of CVA, we understandably, donors ask humanitarian organizations to pursue value for money, and that's really based around the 4 E's of economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. So Sumananjali, I mean, what do you think are the main tensions and potential challenges to ensuring quality for recipients when we have to deliver large-scale CVA programs? And, you know, does operating at scale mean that incorporating recipient needs and feedback in program design is necessarily more challenging?
To respond to your question, I will pick up the poll today. That's where the tension is. And you can see what Sapanzi presented as 67%, basically thinking that we are doing great. And the poll today showing a majority of us in this community feeling that we are doing very little. And that clearly shows the tension because, and again, the question is by whose standards, right? So who actually defines what it looks like? My take of my experience of the tension actually comes in at the design phase, where I'll try to put it in different axes. So one is, of course, the time factor. So if there is a rapid onset, something that has happened quick and a massive destruction and devastation has happened, you want to go in quickly. And you want to do a big scale, operations, be it an earthquake or whichever kind of, rapid onset. And that point of time, you are also trying to look into what are the resources needed and how much of time do you need to have a whole full-fledged, recipient feedback into the design itself. Of course, then it also includes, whether the modality is good enough or not, whether the value is good enough or not, and lots of these kind of tensions come up, specifically when there is a demand to deliver quite fast at a very, high scale of operation, and then of course the resources needed and the time that you will lose in that. I also feel that it's kind of a other way around as well. So when you also want to do a big scale program, you kind of tend to, I have a sense that where you are doing even on a softer ground, and even if it's not a rapid onset, there is, and I'm trying to be provocative here, I think there is sometimes a bit of a deliberate ignorance that we want to put aside, so that we probably know that what we are trying to achieve is not the best, but in the name of humanitarian assistance and CVA program that we want to do and we want to reach scale. So let's not just talk about it. Let's push it under the carpet. Let's not talk about what actually makes sense for the recipient, because we know, given our experiences of the field, that this is not the best. I have often heard in very many forums where people have said, okay, it's not the best, but it's at least something is better than nothing, right? So we do, and this is why I am being provocative and saying that we know we are not doing good programs. And we tend to, say that, okay, everything is done. And of course, CVA has become the most fashionable thing, over the years, and every organization, whether we understand it the best way or not, we want to be in the new generation terminology. We want to be in that generation, X generation, so that we don't feel left out. And this is where I feel that as practitioners, we don't give enough time and energy, and we don't budget enough, and we don't advocate enough to give that space for us to be able to collect a recipient feedback. I do feel that over the years, the post distribution, if I may use that, the monitoring and the recipient feedback on the second half of the project is better. People are having better monitoring tools to monitor. But again, this is my personal experience. Our feedback is all about what we have delivered and what they have used it for, and whether they had customer satisfaction or not, whether they had to queue up longer or walk longer. It's a very, very, very myopic way of how we define our monitoring tools against our design. I don't think our monitoring tools ever look into questions to question the design itself. So even if we didn't do it before, doing the design and going ahead with the implementation, I don't think our feedback actually goes into that question of saying, do you even think that what we did was the right thing in the first place? And then let's go to the modality and the amount. And but no, our questions will be, how much money did you receive, or what voucher did you receive, and how did you use it? And this happens to be a real tension, I think, where organizations are more towards numbers. We reached X numbers. How many annual reports or organizational websites will tell you 1 billion people or 10 million, or we kind of have moved into that jurisdiction where we love numbers more than the impact on, I'm sorry to say this, but it kind of, it makes you feel like, oh, only you reached, it was such a big crisis in Ethiopia with Tigray, and you just did 50 people? Seriously? So you kind of feel like you will be again left out. And this tension is something that is real, but the more we have more honest conversation about it, the more we have open conversation and dialogue with donors and try to make sense of it, then we will do a better quality program where we actually truly take recipients' feedback in process. However, I also feel that when we work in a jurisdiction where we know that this is a conflict, or this is a drought prone or a flood prone, or we always talk about preparedness as well. We talk about preparedness plan, and we know that we are in a space where, as humanitarian actors, something or the other will crop up. In that place. Sorry.
No, you're here. We lost you for a second.
Okay, so how effectively are we, using our presence either directly as organizations ourselves or the partners we are working with to gather that information? And many a times we see CVA as, as a program that will come when a crisis will happen. It's not integrated enough into our regular programs. And cash is basically a modality. You can use it for shelter, education, whichever. Why are we not being able to collect that information is something that I wondered in our regular programs. Because the more we are able to gather that information, we don't have to run around when a crisis happens in terms of looking at what does the the recipient opinion look like, and that's how I would present it.
Thanks, Sumananjali. That was really interesting, and I see a lot of our panelists nodding their head, and so I'd love to get some reactions from you. But before that, I mean, you touched on a really. Sorry,
yeah, I lost you for a few seconds.
Okay, you touched on something I think that is at the heart of this debate is like effective M&E systems, right? And building evidence on the effectiveness and impact of cash transfer programs. There have been studies, for example, by Ground Truth Solutions that document recipients' perspectives and experience, and what quality means to them. And there is this disconnect between the recipients and the donor agencies. So Caroline, I wanted to ask you, you're at Give Directly have dispersed about $75.8 million out of the 100 million target that you have during the COVID response. And one of the pillars for Give Directly is really building the strong evidence of your program and feeding that evidence into design through a variety of ways. And so Sumananjali was just saying, some of the M&E tools in place are not really capturing the recipient feedback more at like a broader level. Maybe it's just project specific. So just wondering how Give Directly is really capturing this feedback, and how is it being really fed into course correction. And I think with that is what's really important is this concept of trust and agency as well with recipients. So if you can, speak to that.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Maha. And really just wanted to add to the idea of scale versus quality. And one thing I wanted to point out is, before we go into the M&E, aspect of cash and voucher-based programming, I think that the actions that we take to include recipients' voices should also take cognizance that speed is of the essence in terms of how we make the decisions and incorporate them in our designs and implementation decisions. And I say this because we are moving very fast in a tech world where, cash and voucher-based assistance is going to be driven by, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and predictive data generation. And, just echoing what, other speakers have said, that if we are going to be thinking localization, then we have to imagine how much some of these communities are far removed from the technological advancements that we are heading to, and the fact that as we move deeper into, machine learning and predictive data curation, that there is a high possibility that the exclusion of local voices is going to be more loud. And unless we take very, deliberate steps to include voices before we start cash-based programming, then we may never be able to design sound cash and voucher-based assistance. And that's because most of these programs are really spontaneous. And I'll give you an example. If today, God forbid, an earthquake hit Haiti, all of us will run there to go and deliver what we know best, whether that is cash or vouchers or material assistance. What we will not know is the choices of those people and their adaptability and resilience information. That exactly is what we should be having upfront by involving local organizations to identify global hotspots and be able to help us generate people's knowledge, local knowledge, contextual resilience measures and markets and all those, so that we can incorporate them in the designs of these programs. So that, you can imagine that we can generate such huge data and deliver vouchers and cash to millions of people at the click of a button, without engaging those communities, without understanding them, without knowing what to do. And because of that scale, we also have to think about what is the feedback loop. How do we give those millions of people an effective opportunity to be able to look back and give us reports out of the work that we've done with them, so that we can know how best we can respond the next time we do it. Coming to your question, Maha, on M&E and how we listen to recipients' voices. At Give Directly, we actually have 3 arms of how we can generate data. And the first one is, providing a feedback mechanism that enables us to be able to do an outbound customer service operation that contacts recipients. Immediately we enroll them into the programs, and also an inbound free to call hotline that allows them to call us and tell us what their experiences have been. But we know that there is a limitation in that. The limitation, as has been mentioned there, is that most of the time when it is outbound, we tend to ask questions that respond to our design and help us respond to the things that make us smile. What we have done to do that is to help us, be able to get deep dive into the voices of recipients, is we have introduced a firewalled team. And that firewalled team is not known to the operations team, not known to the call center team. And their work is to independently go out and ask recipients questions that typically the designers of this program. So we have a team that exists almost like an independent monitor internally, does not interact with the operations team, but asks those hard questions. Did they talk to you nicely? Did they bring this money in time? Did you feel respected? While they were taking your data, did they give you an opportunity to understand what that data would be done with? Do you know where this data is going to after this? Have you been able to call and ask hard questions? What has happened to you after receiving this assistance, positive or negative? And because of that firewalled objective unit, we have an autonomy to be able to ask hard questions to the ops team and be able to ask them, hey, we think that at that point, we don't think that you're getting recipient consent, and we don't think you're doing the right thing. Can we incorporate that and be able to see that that is being incorporated? So on an ongoing basis, there is someone who is asking hard questions. We do that for all our programs, including the work that we're doing right now with COVID-19. Level number 3 is doing quantitative researches, basically randomized controlled trials that help us ask hard questions about things that we want to understand systematically. So for example, if we wanted to understand, are we truly localizing, or is localization actually practical? That such a decision would define long-term design and implementation of our programs, and that would require a randomized control trial, very systematic study. And we've asked ourselves questions ranging from how does cash and voucher-based assistance, and for us it's cash because that's what we deliver, how does that impact the economic landscape of the communities that we are, that we are sending money to? How does it affect the economic equilibrium, inflation, local markets, neighbors who did not receive money? What happens to them? How does that cash impact them positively or negatively? What is the best targeting criteria? Should we be saturating or should we be targeting? Should we be using proximity tests? And we ask those in randomized control trials to help us understand the best decision for how to, refine our design. So there is that ongoing monitoring, Maha, which is basically feedback coming in through the call center and feedback coming in through the independent firewalled team that helps us to refine our surveys, refine our targeting criteria, our training for our staff. But there is also that higher level randomized control trials that give us more longer term design decisions.
Thanks, Caroline. That's really interesting. And actually, I might put Seb or Killen on the spot here because, that's a lot of investment that Give Directly is putting into these research systems and having separate teams. And, I'm curious about what recommendations, Seb, maybe it's from a donor, and Killen as a local organization, what recommendations do you have to humanitarian organizations that may not be able to invest as much in these robust systems? And then also, correlated to that is still the idea of like, how do we ask recipients who are dependent on us for aid to be honest with us about, what you have delivered to them? So I don't know, Seb or Killen, if you have anything to say to that.
All right, Maha, can you hear me? I don't know if that's working. Yeah, it is. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, it's I don't have the magic answer, I'm afraid, but I do think there's I guess, when organizations are planning a response and starting the process of targeting, identifying, and so on, I think that monitoring element needs to be absolutely fitted as a core element or a core part of the response. It shouldn't be an add-on. And I think this is where there is a tendency, and I think, Caroline, what you were saying was really interesting, because I think the world has clearly moved on. When I started many years ago, M&E was sort of down the corridor or somewhere that you only had to speak to them once a year. Nowadays, with digital technology, with the speed at which we can get and receive information and actually collect it extremely cheaply, when you're looking at SMS systems, all that kind of call center stuff, using WhatsApp, using all sorts of social media platforms and so on, considering that we're dealing with often a much more urbanized, a younger population, especially in East Africa. East Africa is changing hugely in terms of connectivity. And of course, there are equity issues. But it's really getting that and using all of those systems, which are now pretty cheap and effective. And I think it's less about the kind of, do we need to have a really expensive system, but rather, how do we, even with the resources that we have, actually take the information that we can collect, but actually use it? And actually turn it around and actually feed it back into operations, so that actually those voices are actually being heard, and actually there's being action taken based on the feedback. And I think too often what we've seen is that we've collected a vast amount of data and information, but it's stored somewhere in a cloud or in a platform, somewhere, and it's not used to its full potential.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add to this before we move on? No? Okay, great. So actually, Seb, my next question is to you. It really centering around accountability. So we've touched on this idea of trust building and agency of recipients. So as a donor, I'm just curious how, what role donors can play in building a system of accountability and transparency amongst your own organization, but also humanitarian organizations and others, where we really put recipients at the heart of the CVA design, progress, learning, and holding ourselves accountable where more needs to be done.
Yeah, thanks, Maha. I mean, I think, firstly, thanks a lot for inviting me onto this panel discussion. It's a real pleasure to be here. And going through the report, I think there's a lot of really good recommendations in the report which need to be looked at. I mean, I think, as I was saying a little bit before, I mean, clearly the world is changing. East Africa is changing, and of course, it's not a uniform situation. I think comparing Somalia and Kenya and Ethiopia are a very, very different context, and I think we need to understand that. I think as donors, I mean, when looking at what the investment is actually required for this kind of activity, and of course, I'm not speaking on behalf of all donors. I'm here as a member of FCDO. There's a part of me which thinks that there is a greater investment that's required, and that's both financial one, but also a kind of human resource. I think we need to, as an industry, start to really rethink a little bit how we're delivering and what we're delivering. And I think that's where I think as FCDO, what we've done in Somalia, and that's where I work, we've tried really hard to look at this problem of how can we collect data on behalf of our partners and get information directly from the recipients of our assistance. And then how can we feed that back to partners? And I'll be honest, it's not always been plain sailing. It's a difficult thing to do, because there are some deep problems which the report goes into, and I think as aid practitioners we're probably all aware of them, but we don't always like to talk about the kind of vested interests in the system that we have. And Killen, you were mentioning before this, around localization. I think a lot of these issues come out as to do we replace international with local? How do we actually use local? And these are fairly seismic issues in effect for our industry to start to really deal with. But I think there are some principles which we've tried to sort of put at the center of what we're doing, and with greater or not success, but certainly what we've been trying is around this notion of transparency. So how can we make sure that information that's collected, whether that's Give Direct or NRC or whomever, but how do we make sure that information is actually shared more widely across the system, so that actually this learning of information is spread far wider? And there we come across all sorts of problems, in particular around when partners get information. I think Killen touched on this as well. When the information comes back and it's all very positive and rosy, we find that people are very prepared to share that, and the sort of the good news stories are always very welcome. What of course is less evident is how do we share bad news, or how do we share the findings that are not quite as good, where beneficiaries or recipients are not telling us that everything's rosy, but actually that things need to change. And that's something which I think we're trying to do more and more. We're creating learning events and trying to bring people together to have that sort of transparency. And I think there's then this question in my mind around the it's that honesty that we need to start building into our systems. So learning from what's not working. Of course, we need to look at the risks and data protection issues and so on, but we shouldn't use that as simply sort of a technical way of avoiding this question. I think we need to get through this notion of data protection and accountability and stuff, and we need to use that and go through it and come out the other side as being somewhere where we can actually all appreciate and understand what it is that we're trying to do. And of course, cash has been the great disruptor, right? I mean, it's really helped to sort of pose a lot of questions, which, as a sort of siloed humanitarian aid response system or industry, the sort of post-World War II system that we've created, cash is the one that's really starting to break all of that apart. And the questions, Killen, you sort of mentioned, but how many partners do we need to deliver this? type of assistance now? And how do we, when we talk about local, do we also mean, let's get private sector, let's get the banks, let's get other institutions and agencies involved to try and get better efficiency, better value for money. And I think there is this tension very much around the kind of monopolistic tendencies that we have in the kind of competitive industry that we're in. And so so we need to sort of start confronting that. I'll maybe end with, I think what we've done as a donor is very much trying to put this accountability system at the very heart of what we're doing, and not just around cash, but around everything that we're doing. And I think what we're proving more and more is that actually, even in the most complex environments, even in the hardest to reach areas, there are actually very few spots now in East Africa, I would contend, where you cannot actually reach people, or you cannot make the effort to go out and find the people that we're supporting and ask them the right questions and try and collect that feedback. And so I think there's seeing and even the term beneficiary is a little bit awkward, I think, these days. And I think there's a groundswell now of thinking, whether that's sort of the aid colonialization aspects, the Black Lives Matter, the localization elements. I think all of this is coming together at a time when we need to start seriously rethinking what it is that we're doing, how we're doing it, and how we start measuring it. And I think as a donor that we want to be part of this discussion, but actually the real conversation, which is a bit like this, has to also take place within organizations and between organizations who have been set up to support and to deliver this type of assistance. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Seb. I know we're running a little short of time, but I do want to ask the other panelists, as you are implementing programs, do you see some of this? Like, are you able to share lessons with donors on some of the stuff that's not so rosy? And are you seeing a shift in the donor landscape that's not only placing higher priority on CVA, but also, of course, understanding recipients' views and allowing you to also collect some of that data, and meaning the investment?
Yeah, thanks, Maha. First of all, I think, thanks, Seb. One of the things we need to recognize is that the humanitarian space is no longer about the donors, UN and large international organizations. The humanitarian space is including the government, and it includes, most importantly, the communities themselves. If it was possible, I would imagine that we should remove everybody else and just let the communities get empowered and capacitated so that they can organize and manage their, the response. If it is to be locally led, then let the communities lead it themselves. But again, as I said, it's not about removing or replacing, it's about understanding what the system looks like and not looking at it mostly from the donors or from the UN's point of view or from the international NGO's point of view. Look at the humanitarian ecosystem as something that is so wide now, including the corporates, including the telecommunications companies, or technology offering companies, and see how they all participate in this. And in terms of accountability with info, of course, the donors will have to unlearn something. The donors will need to unlearn also how to not, penalize the NGOs for what is supposed to be learning and not call it failure. Because I think for a long time if anything did not go well, the donors say that is a failed project or it's a failed activity. Remember, some of these projects are delivered in a way that has not even been piloted before. And therefore, there will be a lot of learning, some of it classified as mistakes or failure. So I think if we all begin to learn, to get into the learning space, into the learning zone, all of us, we will do a lot of good by improving the way we deliver.
So we have time for one more. Caroline, I know you wanted to say something before we move on to questions.
Yep. Yeah, I just wanted to talk to the issue of transparency. But before I speak to transparency, one thing I wanted to also speak to is, that cash and voucher assistance has mostly been in the humanitarian space and, in disaster responses and contexts like refugee settings. But we are seeing increasingly that cash is being used even in development. And I think that it's time for us who, have been here longer, have done this work to start building, an advocacy pipeline that helps local actors to better understand cash. Like, we should not be expecting local actors to just embrace cash from whatever it is that they've been doing and start doing it well. Cash has lots and lots of, areas that need to be checked. And that brings me to accountability, that when you think about cash, for people who've not interacted with cash a lot, the first thing would be to point out the lots and lots of risks that come with cash. With or without the knowledge, the fungibility of cash means that it can be transferred. Its use can be transferred to many things. And depending on where you're coming from, which divide you're coming from, you can either start imagining that if you give people, for example, what we do at Give Directly, that if you give people unconditional cash, they're going to spend it on booze and alcohol. And somebody may just ride with that myth and hold it as a belief. And, we've also had donors ask questions about, do we think that cash actually exposes recipients to more safeguarding risks than other interventions? And this is where we require rigorous assessments and randomized control trials to help us better understand what the interaction of cash and the communities that receive it actually does in terms of the negative effects. That said, I think that it is also upon us to be very transparent with our donors, to be able to speak when things don't go right, and share with them some of the lessons we are learning, because it is only then that we can build their confidence and help them know that, look here, things are not always rosy. Sometimes they go wrong, but please know that even as we do this implementation, we are aware that things may go wrong. People can be abused, people can lose their transfers, there can be conflicts in communities, exclusion-related challenges, and we are monitoring those. We are trying to address those that we can address, and we are trying to use those responses from the communities to inform the design of our programs and make sure that at the end of the day, recipients have a better experience and donors are more empowered to make the right decision about dedicating resources to cash and voucher-based assistance.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. I'm actually gonna, that point that you just raised, Caroline, about the risks involved in cash. I know that GSMA is coming out with a study that with ground truth solutions on user journeys for mobile money, and really one of the recommendations is putting human-centered design at the heart of programming and to understand recipients and building around their concerns. And so I just wanted to go to one of the first questions. How do you think affected communities really can have agency in CVA programs? Something that we were discussing, like, why isn't this happening, and what drivers really need to be there to make some of these changes? I know this is a complex question. Would anyone like to answer that? And I think within this question, there's also the element of, well, when we're talking about agency and CVA programming, that's linked to, an issue with M&E, like, does that reflect the disparity of power? Like, I am giving you this money and I'm going to ask you questions. So you need to answer me. Yes, Caroline.
So I just wanted to make, make an attempt to that. And, there are two phases. And just like I had said, that the layers of M&E would depend on what you want to hear as an organization. And as organizations, most of the time, you want to hear what speaks positively to the design of your program, and especially what your donors want to listen to, especially if you're signing contracts and agreeing on certain deliverables. You'd want to center your M&E, to those questions. Some of those will definitely be, recipient-centered, and donors would also want to hold us to account to make sure that we deliver on stuff that actually represent a very positive recipient experience, like donors wanting to know whether, you know, there are escalations of safeguarding issues, whether recipients are receiving their transfers and spending it correctly. But still, we also need to, you know, give the communities an opportunity to input into that, you know, space for monitoring, so that the voices that we are not activating, like they are voices that we trigger ourselves. But is there a way that communities can also actually ask us hard questions? And that's the second layer of M&E, where we actually ask communities, is it all going right? Do you believe this is the right thing for you? Would you take this a second time? And I remember within Give Directly, there is one time that we actually asked recipients what their, you know, their impression or their preference was for, you know, receiving lump sum grants versus receiving floor payments of, you know, monthly smaller grants. And that is one way of giving them a voice and giving them an opportunity to help us make the right decision that responds to their needs. That people told us that they would prefer to get their transfers upfront so that they can make bigger investments rather than giving them little by little and they have to spend it on food and daily needs. And, you know, that's not something that the design of your project can tell you. It is the people who are spending the money who can actually tell you, hey, please give me this money every month, or give me this money upfront as a lump sum. And these are the kind of things that, you know, you want to also invest in generating that knowledge upfront before we start investing in delivering the cash. Because like we say, cash comes as a spontaneous program because it's driven by agency, especially in humanitarian settings. So the agency that communities are supposed to be calling for or contributing to may not be practical in a situation where they've found themselves in a rut and they need a very quick response and they need a way to get themselves out of those situations. So giving them an opportunity upfront, and also post transfers, we should also give them an opportunity to tell us what we could have done better.
Yeah. So Maha, what I could add just to reinforce what Caroline is talking about is that, you know, if you are coming to assist me because my house was broken and it needs to be repainted, should I have a say around, you know, the colors you're going to use in my house to repaint it? Should I allow you to paint the red lights and blue and yellow colors on my wall without my say? And I think that a lot of times that's what happens because, you know, after all, the house is painted anyway, but, you know, without my input and without my liking anyway. So we should be more respecting and appreciate that the glass is always not half empty, but it's half full, and be humble enough to learn what actually do the communities put in effort to make the glass half full.
Great, thank you. Another question that we got sort of related to this topic is that is around data protection. And I know, Seb, that you brought this up briefly. So there's a concern for recipients' data protection, especially when they are multiple layers of stakeholders. And this is more of an issue right now during COVID. So in an attempt to ensure accountability, how can data protection be enhanced? And even as we look at it from the localization context.
Can I jump in on that one? I mean, because I think it's an interesting, and I'd like to hear actually from the operational agencies what the thinking is on this, because I think this is an area where, you know, the humanitarian system, the aid system actually is just trying to catch up with, you know, with banking systems and so on, and I think we're learning a lot over the past 4 or 5 years about what these sorts of data protection rules and regulations, you know, what it actually means in practice. I mean, I think there's a technical element to this which I'm not well enough versed to be able to opine on, but there's a sort of, I think there's a kind of political element to this as well, which is, do we actually want to address this? You know, do we actually want to go through to the other side of this question and actually find a way of working through data protection issues to be able to be more accountable and more transparent and more honest with the people that we're trying to serve? Or do we want to, and this is tragically, you know, maybe something that I've felt with in discussions with certain partners, is that there's been a real temptation to perhaps use the data protection issue, and I know this will probably provoke a whole barrage of comments about me, but using it as a bit of a sort of fig leaf to not actually engage. And I think there's, there are genuine concerns which need to be addressed in terms of where the data is held, how we're telling recipients, what's being done with their data, and those things are, but these are all possible to overcome. And when we think about it in simplistic terms, what we're actually doing is we're moving from what was essentially a resource transfer of stuff, whether that be food, water, nutrition, whatever it is that we were doing 20 years ago or 10 years ago, where all of that data, it's the same data that we had then in terms of beneficiary lists and all the rest of it. The difference was that they were stuck in folders and put in a filing cabinet in a sub office somewhere, and occasionally kind of someone would look at them. And quite often, in my experience, the cabinets were never locked. People had access, everyone had access, and so on. You just hope that no one would come from, whichever side that you didn't want to have access to. So of course now it's different because everything's online, it's on the cloud and so on. But there are data protection. Banks manage this. Are we actually learning from industry leaders when it comes to KYC elements, data protection of storage of information, and so on. And I think I think it's high time that the aid industry really kind of started to use the technology and use the standards, the higher standards that are being used by the banking sector, for example. And of course things do go wrong, but by and large, I'm sure we all have bank accounts and we all have our data stored somewhere. And I think it comes down to a question of also of choice. We choose to bank with a certain bank, or we choose to engage and buy our stuff online or whatever it might be. The problem we have here is that question of choice. And again, this is an industry-wide problem. If you're in a sort of vulnerable community somewhere, you often will not have a choice in who your service provider is. You will simply be in the catchment area of, Give Directly or NRC or whomever, and that's your catchment area, and you don't get to say, actually, I'd rather go with this supplier or that supplier. And so I think there's a, this whole data protection, know your customer, all of this kind of stuff, I think we need to modernize, and we need to sort of really start seeing it again from the perspective of the people that we're there to support. And how do they feel about it? And are we explaining very clearly to people, as I think Carolyn said, where are we going to keep your data? What data are we going to take from you? How is it going to be used? Who's going to have access to that? And at what point are we going to get rid of it? Thanks.
Thanks, Seb. Sumananjali, I'm not sure if you are online, back online, and how much you heard of that, but we were talking about data protection and privacy. And I was just wondering if I can put you on the spot, because I know you are part of the CCD, the Cash Collaborative Delivery. I think I said that wrong, sorry. But just wondering, when there are these multiple stakeholders involved in a program, like how are you addressing this issue of data privacy, consent, as we're implementing CVA programs, and and I think consent plays a role in that. You are on mute.
So I switched on my camera, and so yeah, I think as a CCD in Ethiopia, of course there are quite a number of organizations coming together, and we are trying to actually. It's an interesting space because we are having these hardcore discussions about, what matters the most, the heart of the conversations around a recipient, feedback around in the design phase, in terms of how do we make sure that there is data protection. Of course, Ethiopia is in a very different space in consideration to Kenya, for example, in terms of technology and what can be done. But the beauty is because there are quite a number of organizations coming together and putting our heads together with different sectoral people coming there. We are discussing modalities. We are discussing what does the value look like. We are discussing what does markets mean, and where what is possible, where what is not possible. But also more importantly, in terms of the confidentiality and data protection. Right now, we still don't have a system to say that, okay, this is what we are following and this is where our data is stored and this is how we are going to do it. But there is a very, very deliberate effort being made. It's quite nascent, it's quite new in terms of, bringing together. And I hope you would agree, I'm sure you would agree that when very many organizations come together, just to coming to a space where everybody is in consensus that, yes, we need to move this, takes quite substantive time. But then there are donors who are quite interested in investing into this, CCD platform, both from like a third-party M&E, trying to help us have those participatory research in terms of getting feedback. So I wouldn't say for sure that we are where we want to be, but I can say for sure that there is enough interest and willingness from different organizations, part of the CCD, to be taking all these different aspects of a CVA program into consideration, so that when we do it, we not only achieve scale, but we actually are talking about quality programming on CVA. So we have actually looked into the entire spectrum of things, and we are not doing it as a patchy thing, this one and that one, or, we leave out some. So that's what I would say. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And I know that CaLP is coming out with a data starter kit building on the work that Elon did. So that will be great. And so we have so many great questions and we're running out of time. So I have one more question, and I think it's to you, Killen, and others. It's really about this idea about market. And so how do you really approach market distortion in CVA programming? And Killen, I guess to you as well in your program in South Africa that you had mentioned. You are on mute.
Yeah, realize. Thanks. I think there is the market distortion would be a result of either, if you probably using aid in kind, or if you did not do a proper research on what the intervention needs to address, and come up with a reasonable transfer value, etc. So I don't think there is, maybe someone else in the panel can help me whether that is a significant risk, maybe with the cash and vouchers. But everything that, for example, in the South Africa experience and the explanation that I gave, example that I gave, it's all, looking at everything working within the local market system. So it's the shops, that sell the vegetables and the fruits and the local grocery stores that the communities interact with on a daily basis. So therefore, I don't see any risk on the distortion. The transfer is and food assistance.
Yes, Caroline.
I just wanted to add to what Killen has said about, market distortion, and just wanted to call up, a study that we conducted here in Give Directly and released last year, which is basically called General Equilibrium. And what it sought to assess is how cash impacts the local economies. And the biggest fear was that if you inject so much money into small economies, especially in rural communities, would that distort markets, mess up people who did not receive the transfers, or just like trigger increased inflation? And the results were quite impressive. And that owes to exactly what Killen says about fungibility of cash, and especially when people have the choice to use the money, unconditional cash. People have the choice to use the money in ways that changes their lives in the way they know best, then the variability of how they spend that money does not distort the markets, because needs are as many as the people we support. So you will not find that everybody is going to buy a specific item so that there is, basically depletion. But one thing that we saw also in that study is that after we had sent over 1,000 people money, that the results showed that people who did not receive money, especially people who were in the local markets, actually gained 2.6 times more than the actual transfer value that we provided to the recipients, which means the moment the money hits the communities, it actually starts redistributing itself into different hands. So a primary recipient shares with someone who's maybe selling animals in the local market. They bring the animal home and they need someone to take care of the animals. They employ someone. That cash gets into two more hands again. They spend it on food, part of it on food. That cash goes to a grocery market holder. So it's really an interesting question, but something that we have found that actually there isn't significant market distortion. And I think Give Directly would be one of those organizations that would be asked that big question, because we are injecting actually big value dollar amounts. $1,000 per household saturated in villages is not little money if you look at actual value that goes into those markets. And still the randomized control trial provided support for stability and growth of market and individual household economic well-being.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm actually going to hand it over to Sipenzi. I know we're 1 minute over, so I thank everyone for their patience, and I thank the panelists as well for a really great discussion today.
Thank you, Maha, and thank you to all the panelists, Sumananjali, Caroline, Seb, and Killen, for sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you for all the questions and comments that came in through the Q&A and the chat box. And now what? So what next? My call to action is for each of us to reflect on some of the key ideas that are coming out of the discussion today. We had the role of localization in the contextualization of CBA, the need to give more space, budget, and time to incorporate as feedback into our programming. We also heard about the need to adjust our monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to be less about numbers and more about and be more qualitative. We also heard about organizations having internal teams that are separate from the implementation teams that are dedicated to listening to recipient voices. We heard about the need to share learning, both the good and the bad, and a lot more. And I just want to say that please reflect on these ideas, and if you do take them forward, please come back and share the learning with us. Let's keep talking and sharing the learning, as we heard from one of the panelists, because it's in the sharing that we find the solutions. We are going to end here, and thank you all for joining. Have a good rest of the day.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye.